The Dean of WildUte University joins us on the Big Mountain to talk private capital. There's no offseason in college football, so we're back on the Big Mountain with an interview with the Wild Ute. Hey, welcome back to the Big Mountain. I'm JY. This is my good friend Steve. We have a very special guest on yet again here, the Wild Ute. He is co-host of the College Football Mafia YouTube channel, also the Dean of WildUte University. We're going to be talking about some items here that we have to have a dean of a university on here so that we know what we're talking about. We're going to be talking about private capital, private equity, if you will. A lot of news, especially with the Big 12 here recently regarding private capital. So, hey, WildUte, welcome to the Big Mountain.
Hey, thanks for having me on, guys. Good to be on.
We're really glad you could spend some time with us. I think, Big 12 fans probably know a little bit more about private capital than maybe just about any others because Brett Yormark's really been talking about this for quite a while. But then just last week, we learned that they're putting a pause on private capital. So let's take a step back. I'd love to hear from you first, maybe a Cliff Note version if we can. And again, we want to keep this engaging as much as we can with viewers, but we are talking finances, so we got to dig down a little bit. But can you give us maybe the Cliff Notes of what private capital is, kind of where we've been at here over the recent history here, and then we'll get into maybe the whys and the best practices, if we will.
Private capital is a funding source for companies, organizations, and college football in the near future here. It comes in different types of investment, but you can think of it as an investment in a college sports department. There's a lot of chatter going on right now in the Big 12, just as you mentioned, JY, too, about Yormark saying we're not going to go with private capital at this time. But guess what, guys? The Big Ten and the SEC are both in consideration, too, of private capital because they're working with a couple investment banks right now. So we're talking like all of almost the A4 level looking at private capital, and there's a plethora of reasons for it. It's super important. You need to understand this.
Awesome. Well, I know I don't understand it real great in terms of how it relates to college athletics. I hear private capital, and my first thought is, oh, you're giving up ownership. And who in the world would ever want to do something like that? I think I'm making it way too basic on that, and that's why I want to have you on, and you can maybe broaden my viewpoint as to why these A4 and maybe other conferences might be interested in using private capital in the future. So I appreciate that kind of start. Can we dig into maybe the conferences a little bit more? What exactly are they looking at here?
Yeah, so the Big 12 conference, let's go to the Big 12 because all the smoke's been really around the Big 12. And we need to know a couple things about private capital and private equity. There's a couple different financial structure models and stuff. I know that's big words and everything. Let's simplify it too. It's basically where a private capital slash private equity, you can use them interchangeably. In a traditional structure, they want to buy a chunk of a conference, guys. That's the idea. Dennis Dodd actually came out with an article back in June of 2024 where he talked about a firm named CVC Capital Partners wanting to inject $1 billion into the Big 12 conference for a 20% ownership stake in the conference. So we're talking about CVC Capital Partners would own 20% of the Big 12 conference while the Big 12 itself would own 80%. That is a traditional structure in private equity slash private capital. Is the firm comes in, gives it upfront money, they buy in a small minority stake, and then with that upfront money, whoever is sharing now their ownership can spend it however they wish. And then after the fact, there is more consulting work, there's more partnerships, there's more relationships that the private equity firm brings to the firm that actually wanted to bring the private equity partner in. So in this case, the Big 12 would have allowed CVC Capital Partners to bring 20% stake in the conference for $1 billion. CVC Capital Partners would have been advising the Big 12, growing the Big 12, and actually having some talk about the governance structure of the future of the Big 12 as well. So that is the traditional finance structure for private equity, private capital. But the Big 12 is never really going to bite on this traditional structure. What the Big 12 actually wanted to do was do a deal with Redbird Capital. You might have heard that firm's name before. Redbird Capital is another private equity firm, but Redbird Capital has like a hybrid financial structure where they actually do a little bit different type of investing when they're buying a portfolio company, and that's what they would call like an investment like the Big 12. So Redbird Capital, instead of just buying a chunk of the conference like CVC Capital we just talked about, Redbird actually would be buying a piece of a future new revenue stream. Does that make sense to you guys? A future new revenue stream that they'd help the conference create. Let's just stop it right there. Let's just see if there's any questions and stuff, because we're getting into a realm that's kind of hard to understand.
Sure. Yeah.
So I've got a question.
Sure.
So for Big 12 fans, the common college football fan, why do I like to watch football on Saturdays? Why do I care about this? Is this really going to affect me? Is this a way basically just for the schools and the conferences to make the trains run on time? Or as a fan, if I'm a Utes fan, if I'm a Penn State fan, am I going to see results on the field? Because I want national championships. I want Rose Bowl wins. I want college football playoff berths. I want wins over Ohio State. Is this going to help me get there? Or is this just really kind of just kind of the details in the weeds to keep the trains running on time?
I mean, it's one of the big problems, as we all know, in the Big 10, the Big 12, SEC, there's a huge financial gap, guys. Like the Big 12 conference under the new contract that's currently ongoing, Big 12 schools are getting $32 million in media distributions annually per school. Hey, the Big 10 and the SEC, anywhere from 80 to 100 million. You're talking about a third, approximately a third as much. That's a huge chunk of change that will help the Big 10 and SEC schools rev share with NIL endeavors, with growing their businesses, and being so far back from the Big 12 standpoint, they have to figure out how to bridge that gap. It's all about bridging the gap with the Big 10 and the SEC if you're the Big 12. That's why you'd even be considering giving up future revenue streams or chunkier conference just to compete today so you don't fall further behind. That is the big fear in the Big 12. You can't just get in this huge financial gap, fall further behind, and there's just more and more of a pull away. You got to bridge that gap. And private capital is one way, at least in the short, intermediate term, to bridge the gap and getting in first before Big 10 or the SEC. So the answer is really just to try to catch up from the Big 12's perspective.
Yeah, I can understand that. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit more too later on. I want to get back to kind of that traditional structure versus the hybrid structure. And the traditional structure is what I think of. I mean, as soon as I hear, public equity, I think they're giving up that ownership. As you said, I think we had a slide up here, that CVC Capital Partners piece. That's exactly where I go immediately. But then you also talked about this hybrid model with Redbird, which I think is the one, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe had a little bit more traction with the Big 12.
Right.
I think most people thought that was maybe going to be happening here until this pause. And maybe we'll get to the pause here in a little bit, because I'd love to hear why you think that occurred as well. But with the hybrid approach, that isn't something that I think of right away with public equity. I'm thinking of that traditional model. And you talked about, kind of bringing in new revenue streams.
Yes.
And I guess the capital piece is just based on these new revenue streams. Can you talk about that model a little bit more? Because that's not the one that I would think of, and that's why I am always kind of fearful of public equity.
Yeah, so Redbird Capital does business where they're actually trying to identify through their own consulting, their own research, new revenue streams that a conference currently doesn't have. Here's a couple examples. Naming rights, guys. Remember the All-State 12? We all thought that was a done deal, and apparently it's not, right? But that is a new revenue stream on a sponsorship name. That would be something that Redbird Capital would help create, that new revenue stream, negotiate the contract, and they'd split the revenue that's earned off that new revenue stream if it were to happen with Redbird Capital. So you'd use their network, their system, the relationships. They'd help you with a negotiation. And once you've established that new revenue stream, it would be a split. It's kind of like a revenue share, a revenue slice, however you want to think about it, but it's just sharing the revenue off a brand new revenue stream like that. Another thing too is gambling data. No one's talking about that. That's a huge potential new revenue stream for a conference like the Big 12, SEC, Big 10, where you're sharing the revenue with whoever helps you create that and put the structures in place for it. So what Redbird Capital really does is they slice your business up into components and then they monetize each certain component and they share revenue with the new slices that they're helping you create. So they're not owning the Big 12 at the conference level, but the Big 12 would be sliced. And below that, each revenue stream would be its own limited partnership, joint venture with Redbird Capital, which they'd share the revenue on. I know that's a complicated idea and stuff, but I have a metaphor here that probably would help a little bit.
Mhm.
So with this hybrid structure, okay, picture a river, a normal river flowing down. And then now we're going to keep it simple with everything here. Now picture 5 different streams. So we have a river right here. We've got 5 different streams. Now let's picture those 5 streams flowing into a river and widening the river. So it's getting bigger. Okay. This is illustrating a point of how revenue streams fund like your total operations, your total revenue of a business like the Big 12, the Big 10, or anything else. And so when we're looking at this, what Redbird Capital is doing is they're actually forming a new stream that's going to flow into the Big 12 conference as a whole, but they're going to share the revenue produced from that new stream flowing into the overall river. So that's really kind of just to think about it like a metaphor, like, hey, here's the big river of all the money coming in. These different streams are the different segments of the money coming in, and Redbird just wants to partner on one of the segments that they're going to share revenue for a period of time with. That is different than the traditional structure, as you mentioned, JY, Steve, of actually splitting a chunk of the conference off and everything. And so different businesses, different mentalities, the actual revenue sharing, splitting is a little bit cleaner from a financial standpoint. So it totally makes sense why a private capital company would want to do it. And again, they're just straight new revenue streams too. So the Big 12 would benefit from new sources of revenue they're currently not getting. And so it would be a big win. That's why I think that the fact that Yormark wanted this so bad, but the presidents couldn't support it is pretty shocking, because you're not talking about existing revenue that you're sharing. You're talking about future revenue that you could be earning that you're not earning yet, that could be helping today, though, with a company like Redbird Capital.
Well, let's get into that pause and maybe the president's decision here in just a bit. I want to maybe dig a little bit further into Redbird. And you look at these things. You mentioned some. We had it on the slide here. You gave some examples of the naming rights, the gambling data, event coordination, and I almost take a step back and just say, what are these? I guess you look at it and be like, well, we know what they are. Just go and do it, Big 12. Like we're giving you the list right here. But the conference isn't here as a capital venture, right? It's here as a athletic conference. Like they're worried about Lord knows Title IX and everything that's going on in governance right now. That's taking up probably the majority of all of their time right now. But they also have a conference to run. They have schedules and tournaments and all of this stuff. And that's why they're in existence. So I doubt any of them or many of them have any sort of internal pieces that can handle this type of thing. And so if you don't have it internally, but there's potential out there, revenue potential out there, can we partner with somebody where we're both benefiting, and you call that 20% or whatever it's going to be, a commission for those people to go out and do that. But it's just these conferences, most of these conferences. Now, I don't know the makeup of the organizational charts of the Big 12 or the Big 10, and I don't know what they are, but certainly, they don't have people there marketing their revenue streams and trying to make partnerships and all that kind of stuff. So I think I wanted to say that because it's like when we look at the slides, we're like, oh, well, it's obvious. Well, it may be obvious, but it takes a lot of personnel, a lot of time to go out and even try to get it. And that doesn't mean you're even going to get it. So in this model, the Redbird model, like that's their job. And if they can get you good streams, great. It's a benefit. Yes. And if they don't, what are we missing out on? Like, am I capturing that pretty well there?
Yeah, like these athletic departments are not private equity businesses, and they're not as good. They're not as good as commercializing these different revenue streams and the way to earn money, right? Like private equity companies, they specialize in earning money, guys. That is what they do every day. They're not trying to put a product on the field. Like they just, how can we optimize money generation here? And so bringing somebody like that as a consultant and as a partner is a way to earn more money, because they know how to make money, and they will form new revenue streams and they will make you more money. And so that it's just different businesses. Like you're bringing the experts in. These are the expert money makers coming into your business and everything. And that's great for the short term and the medium term. But like when you're looking at long term, there are some problems with it too.
Yeah.
It's not just all rosy and stuff. So we can dive into some of those problems, guys. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, so I got a follow-up question for you. So I work in higher ed regulation and compliance. So I'm always cognizant of, public universities especially. We followed, the PAC situation when the PAC collapsed, and we followed California law, Florida state law, and how those state laws affect public universities. So I say that as a backdrop for this question of where my line of thinking is going. Now, in the Big 12, from what I understand, you have a mixture of public and private universities. I can think of Baylor and BYU as two privates. Maybe there's some more, but a lot of public universities. We've seen in other states, Florida State considered bringing in PE at the university level, not even the conference level. Kentucky, I think the University of Kentucky has considered turning their athletic department into an LLC that is legally separate from the university. So that's kind of the backdrop of my question. Is there concerns, and maybe it was that part of the pause? How does this work with public universities? A conference is made up of their universities. Those are the pieces that make up the conference. Can you sell an equity stake in a public university? Is that maybe some of the concerns from the Big 12 presidents? Maybe they want to step back and look at it. Maybe they want to look at like the LLC model separating. Can you just speak on that? Just the concerns of the law, public universities, and maybe is that creating a pause?
With the public university, it's going to be a little bit different than the conference level, right? The conference is not a nonprofit organization like the universities are, especially those public universities, right? So the conference can have media rights and package those media rights, these intellectual properties, and sell off different revenue streams and create them. You're not dealing with much problem at the conference level as you are at the school level. That's a great question, though, at the school level, at the public school level, right there. You know how you get around that? The hybrid model.
Yeah.
So, okay, we're talking about a nonprofit organization, your athletic department individually, say your Florida State, say Utah, Penn State. You spin off a sister company, it's actually a subsidiary company that would be a for-profit entity. Then you'd work with private capital to commercialize your revenue streams and slice your revenue streams, just like the conference is talking about. You do the same exact thing by creating a for-profit subsidiary off a nonprofit organization. That's how it would work. It'd be a joint venture, a for-profit joint venture. So you throw everything in an LLC, private capital will come in, and then you slice out the revenue streams at the individual school level as well. It's the same mechanics as at the conference level. It's just a little bit more hairy because of the nonprofit nature of a public school. If you're a private school, you're not going to run into those issues as much. Like, yeah, if you're Baylor's, like if you're Northwestern, like, yeah, you can go ahead, work with private capital and slice those suckers up. But guys, like one of the things that not just like from like the benefit of the Big 12, you got to think at the end of the day with private capital and slicing up revenue streams and commercializing and earning more money. Let me ask you guys a question. Who's paying for that at the end of the day? Who's paying for the more money? Who's actually, so there's more money that's being generated by the conference or the school with private capital. Who is paying that?
Well, nobody is because they're out doing it.
No,
Like,
we
if
are
you do the
paying
hybrid
that.
model.
All of us fans, we are
Oh,
going to
right,
get
right,
commercialized
yeah,
like you would never believe. Like you think it's bad now for ticket sales and everything else.
right. Yeah,
Wait till you bring private capital in
sure.
and they're owning revenue slices. You have no idea how much they can monetize you in the future if that starts happening.
Yeah.
We are going to be paying that. And so they know that we're the end customer and everything. So that's one of the downfalls. It's horrible for the fan because
Yeah.
it's going to cost more to be a fan, to go to games, to get TV rights packages, to watch games. Everything is going to get more expensive when private capital comes in because we are bringing the money. We're the ones bringing the money.
And they're trying to maximize revenue. That's the purpose of any bit, maximize revenue. They're spending money to make as much money as they can.
Yeah, and we are the money. We watching and stuff. We buying. We are the source of money. So it's going to get a lot worse. Well, that's what I'm saying here. Over like the next 5-10 years, once private equity gets in and these streams get in, it's just going to get ridiculous, in my opinion, on how much it's going to cost to be a fan of a school and go to games.
Well, then, from what I'm seeing is a lot of, well, I don't know if a lot of schools, but people who talk about this, they're trying to sell it as shifting the cost burden of the NIL, of the revenue share from the fan to this new PE company that's going to solve everything. But what you're saying is that's not necessarily the case. The PE company is going to come in and figure out ways to take as much money from us, the fans, as they can.
Well, yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, the
Yeah.
money's coming from PE initially to the conference. They get a windfall of money and everything. But then after that, we're the ones that are paying. The fans are going to be paying more and stuff to pay off PE to make sure it's profitable. And they're going to get a return on the profit, right? Like they're going to figure out, they know what they're doing, guys. Like, and they're experts at making money. And so every imaginable way, the fans are going to be commercialized. And
Well,
that's
and
going to cause a lot of issues. Like it's how much can you afford to be a fan? Like if
right.
I'm a University of Utah fan, I'm a season ticket holder. If all of a sudden Utah, spun off and started selling their season tickets with private equity help and a revenue split, how much more am I paying for my season tickets?
Right.
I don't know. Like it's concerning a bit.
Yeah, and we're seeing that even before private equity with, I mean, you mentioned just the media rights. We'll talk about that right now. Subscriptions. And I mean, that's already hitting people. You see people complaining about X, Y, and Z, and we're just at the beginning of that, quite frankly. I think that alone is gonna just continue. And that's not private equity at this point. That's just, the media partners trying to bring in the value or the money that they can. So if we can talk about the pause, because I was a little surprised this came up. It really looked like something was going to happen. I don't know if anybody knew exactly what, but I'll throw up a slide here from Front Office Sports that just talks about, your mark stating, I believe it was last week, towards the end of last week, if I remember, that, this private equity naming rights are on pause. The article here says it appears to be dead. I think on pause and appear to be dead are two very, very different things. But can you talk about that? I mean, you mentioned earlier that maybe the presidents just weren't on board. Obviously, the conference is the members, is the president. So clearly the members weren't on board. Do you have a feel for why that is at this point? Because I mean, your mark's saying like, hey, we've worked on this for over a year. We have all kinds of education on what this could have been and what could be. So, I mean, where was the hang up here, at least for right now, in your mind?
Let's get to the root of this. And okay, so real talk here, guys. You're going as a member school of the Big 12. If you were to sign off on a private capital deal, you're signing new agreements, you're recommitting to a Gore-like structure because private capital isn't going to be funding a bunch of upfront money if like your big schools are going to be leaving the next year. It's just like with these media rights contracts and clawbacks and everything, except to an nth degree even more. So what my view is here, and this is what's going on, is that schools in the Big 12, there's still a little hesitancy to commit for the long term in the Big 12 conference. That's seriously like what's going on here. There's no other way that it makes sense not to do a private capital deal because it could really take the Big 12 to the next level with the relationships that you'd establish with these new revenue streams. You'd be the first in, first movers advantage. There's so many advantages. It's kind of like a no-brainer as long as everybody is on board with it. So the only thing that makes any sense is that there's member schools in the Big 12. I don't know which ones, but of the 16 schools that don't feel comfortable committing to the Big 12 conference in the long run, which you'd have to commit to sign off on a private equity deal.
Wow,
That's huge,
that's
and
huge.
I didn't really think about it that way. But I can tell you, from firsthand knowledge, your school, the Utes, I know that there's been interest from different sources or different perspectives around the Utes program about moving towards the Big Ten. They feel like they have a great program and would fit in well. We've seen Kansas has been brought up as a potential Big Ten SEC team, so it kind of makes sense. Maybe they just don't, we're not at that point yet of stability. Maybe we'll see that after 2030, where everything kind of locks in when we get the new governance structure and we get the next round of expansion. Because I'm sure as a Ute fan, there's got to be Utes fans out there that are thinking the next round of expansion, we're getting that Big Ten invite.
There's Ute fans that are hoping for a Big Ten invite. Of course, everybody in the Big 12 wants an SEC or Big Ten invite. That's the truth of the matter. You're always going to look at trying to upgrade your financial situation, exposure situation. That's the crux here with private capital at the ACC level, at the Big 12 level. If you're the Big Ten and the SEC, you're probably more willing to do it because you don't want to go anywhere. You're running the
Right.
big boys and everything. But if you're any school in the Big 12 conference, Utah, TCU, Kansas, like you mentioned, like schools that think that they might have a shot somewhere else, maybe in Arizona State, hey, do you really want to sign your long-term future revenues away and jeopardize a potential, even if it's kind of pie in the sky, invite to another conference? And then the other possibility too, we're reaching the speculation zone here. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're just talking speculation, but there are some whispers, at least like discussions more about a possible formation of a best of the rest conference too, guys. And like that's where the best of the ACC and the best of the Big 12 might join up to try to max their media rights to get closer to the Big 10, especially if Florida State doesn't end up going to the SEC or the Big 10 conference, right? If you got Florida State and Clemson right there, if they pull away with the best of the ACC and grab Big 12 schools, then maybe that's a better situation for the long term that you got to think about too, that could be breaking sometime between now and 2030. And so there's a lot of things going on realignment wise that like are really kind of at the surface of like underneath it all. Like this is really kind of what's going on. Where's the heart of the matter? Are you willing to commit to the Big 12 in the long run? Which is the best thing for the conference? 100%. And Yormark knows that. That's why it's got to be crushing for Yormark, not getting
Yeah.
this deal done, right? Because it kind of shows there's a little bit of instability still with membership. Maybe in the future, though, once schools feel like they really don't have another landing spot, this gets done. Or maybe some small version of a private capital deal can still get done for the Big 12, where you're looking at small revenue streams that aren't too costly to get out of if the school jumps somewhere else. It still seems like there's probably a deal there, but it's probably not going to be on that huge wide scale as was hoped by Yormark.
Yeah, great point. I'd like to maybe talk about, because you've really opened my eyes here to this Redbird situation, this hybrid model. And can we talk about maybe just overall pros and cons of public capital? We started getting into some speculation there. I'd like to maybe talk about why it could be a good idea, and I think we've talked about some of those already, and maybe some other things that we want to think about. And some of those maybe we have, maybe we haven't, but just some pros and cons to this, and then I have one other follow up to that here eventually. But can you talk about that?
Yeah, so the pros and cons. The pros of joining together with private capital, new money from new revenue streams, so brand new sources of money coming in that you didn't have before. If you go, especially with Redbird, under the Redbird hybrid model, which is, in my view, the best model for college sports.
Hmm.
Also, the new business partnerships, the relationships, that might be the biggest winner of all. You're not just getting upfront money, you're not just getting new revenue streams. Like you've got relationships with these players that know how to monetize revenue streams. They're going to introduce you to new people, going to do new business with new players. Like the relationship is a huge part of it too. Of course, the upfront money that you'd get to help with rev share, to help with NIL, or however you want to spend it, maybe a stadium upgrade. And then this isn't a loan. Like a lot of people get confused too about private capital. Hey, this is just a loan that needs to be paid back over a 20-year period with like collateral or something. This is nothing like a normal loan at all. The structure we're talking about, sharing revenue streams. There's no collateral. There's no promissory note like you'd have in a normal loan too. So there's no collateral involved in here. So if a new revenue stream doesn't work out, that's the risk of the private capital company. You don't really have a lot of liability risk if that doesn't work. So there's really kind of a lot less downside collateral risk too, which is a pro for the Big 12. Now, some cons, like we said already, the biggest con is the member schools have to recommit, really kind of sign over, and to really say the Big 12's we're going to be for the long haul.
Yeah.
Especially if we're getting more dependent on private capital and we're signing contracts with private capital, we're giving away future revenue streams with private capital. Maybe private capital gets in at the university level, like we've discussed too. So it just gets deeper and deeper and entrenched more. You're just getting more and more hooked and into the Big 12 conference. And some schools don't want that at this moment. And again, you do get more reliant on private capital down the line because of the relationships, because of the new revenue streams. You actually become more dependent on them until they want to sell out and sell their investment to some other firms. So you're kind of losing a little bit of control of your conference, at least the revenue stream of your conference. Another factor is you're losing a little bit of governance. So private capital will come, they'd have a seat at the table when the Big 12 are talking about new strategic directions. You're looking now at a huge money partner that's here that's trying to kind of guide that in more of a commercialized way. So you're talking about giving up some of your own autonomy and governance in the Big 12 offices, which might be concerning for some schools in the Big 12 because you're kind of going in possibly in the future when you become more dependent in a way that you don't want to go. And then lastly, also mentioned this before, but commercializing the fans. So you guys, myself, we're going to pay more to watch college football, the game we love. And that's a huge con for everybody.
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing that up. I think that's something I wasn't even thinking about that when you asked the question earlier, but absolutely, that is who will pay the price of that in one way or another. So I got one other question that I have to put out there. Then Steve, you can chime in however you like. But I look at this. I'm going to take a step back here real quick, and I kind of look at this, and you mentioned this earlier. It was like, hey, we need new revenue streams to kind of close the gap with where the Big Ten and the SEC are going. And so I guess I have a multi-phased question here. First of all, I would say, is it a revenue issue or is it more of an expenditure issue? And I don't necessarily mean versus the Big Ten and the SEC. I'm just talking when you look at the Big 12? Like, is the issue that, hey, we don't have enough revenue, or is the issue really, oh, our expenditures really should be looked at? Because we're not, and I hate to say this, I might get some haters for me saying this, but because we're not at the level of
Yeah.
the Big Ten and the SEC, right? So I kind of put that out there, kind of more from an equity or equality standpoint. I think we all kind of know that the power two is the power two. We talked about that kind of briefly over this discussion, and you obviously talked about this very early on, but it's trying to close that gap, right? Call it keeping up with the Joneses or something, like however you want to call it. Am I oversimplifying that, or is that really what this is all about?
It's the arms race to
Yeah,
stay competitive.
yeah,
And in the past, without the new media contracts coming in for the Big Ten and the SEC, it probably was more of an expense problem. Rising coaches' salaries and stuff, trying to minimize expenses to make it more profitable, your athletic department. That's no longer the case, though. With the new media contracts, it's a revenue problem for the Big 12 because you are so far back on the media distributions anyway. The stadium revenues that you're generating, Penn State is over 100,000 seats. Like you're getting a lot more money bringing in just influxes of revenue that you can pay out to pay more expenses and like
sure.
break even at the end of the day or close to it. So where in the past it probably was an expense problem, arms race expense problem that you needed to play if you wanted to be competitive. It's absolutely a revenue problem now. Now, for the at least like, and from the Big Ten's perspective, like it's not really a revenue problem internally and stuff. Everybody's kind of, has a lot of money to spend and everything. Rev share is not going to be an issue because of the media rights money that's coming in. But guys, rev share alone is a problem in the Big 12. Iowa State's even mentioned recently and stuff. They're struggling with future ideas of how to create enough revenue streams to meet the $20.5 million rev share. That's a revenue problem because of the expense now, which is the new NIL related expenses, right? The expenses ramped up by 20 million bucks. And so you need the revenue to offset it. So to me, it's clearly a rev problem now. In the past, it was an expense problem. That's the question.
Well, if I can follow up quick,
Yeah.
Steve, and then I'll go to you. So you mentioned, I think there's an assumption, at least by me. I'm a G6 guy. I'm a Mountain West guy.
Yeah.
I think there's very few G6 programs that are going to be able to meet $20 million. Very few, if any. I don't know of any. And I always just again assumed, being the G6 guy, oh, that those A4 guys, they're all going to max out. They've got all the money and yada yada yada. But it's interesting to hear from you that it sounds like, is it the majority of the Big 12? Can you add some color? I mean, because I don't follow the Big 12. I don't know much about the universities and where they're at financially. What are your thoughts on the Big 12 members? And is it half? Is it who's going to be able to max out? Because in my mind, again, being a G6 guy, you're all going to be able to do it. Clearly, I'm wrong.
Yeah, you're wrong about that. Actually, like it's probably about half to 65% of the Big 12 is going to max out the full rev share.
Okay.
There's like your schools that came over, your Houstons, your Cincinnatis, they didn't at least have a full distribution level. They were taking partial distributions. I think it's going to take some ramp up years and stuff to get to that place where they can full rev share on some of
Okay.
these members. Utah, BYU will do max rev share of 20.5 million across all the athletic department. Right, football's getting a huge chunk of that, probably 15 million or so. But not all the Big 12 schools currently can afford it. Like Iowa State's dipping into like their coffers to afford the rev share this year. They mentioned next year they're doing the same thing. They don't have projections that show they can meet that number in the future. Iowa State's AD's mentioned that before, and he's being candid about it. There's other schools in the Big 12 that are struggling to meet that today. So you'd actually need some private capital. Some of that money would go towards rev sharing and meeting the full 20.5 million rev share max. That's just like the state of like the financials in the Big 12. Looking over at the Pac-12 schools that came over, Utah for the first time in a long time had a deficit, athletic deficit, partially because like remember the Pac-12 Comcast payments and everything before they moved over to the Big 12 conference. There's a lot of noise in the financials, but Arizona, the Wildcats have had deficits, pretty heavy deficits. ASU's had heavy deficits. Colorado, we're talking about schools that aren't even, baseline reporting a profit or surplus now, that have to meet this new rev share number. There's more media rights coming in from the Big 12 than there was the Pac-12, but that's not enough to meet the new rev share numbers. So they got to figure out more ways to get revenue in. And that's why private capital is so attractive, guys.
Appreciate that.
Colorado couldn't afford Dion on his first contract, and they just gave him a big new extension. So,
yeah, you figure it out, right?
Yeah, you figure it out. It doesn't surprise me regarding Iowa State. I mean, Iowa is not a rich state, and they're the number 2 program in the state.
Right.
So it doesn't surprise me with the Big 12 being, and you guys, you're in that transition point between the power 2, the haves, the rich, and the G6. You guys are in that middle, that mushy middle there. So it doesn't surprise me. I want to, before you leave us, I want to get your gut feeling, because this really has felt for a while. Your Mac, I mean, he's a great salesman. Some people might say he's kind of a carnival barker, whatever, but it feels like he's kind of dragging the conference. He wants to keep them, matched up with the Power 2. Basically, wants to be like the third tag along with the Power 2. He's doing everything he can. He's keeping the conference in the news, everything. And this, I mean, you got to give him credit for this idea, especially the hybrid, the Redbird deal that you talked about. And it just feels like one of those things where he's doing everything he can to drag the conference kicking and screaming. And the presidents maybe are just dragging their feet a little bit. So what is your gut? Do you feel like it looked like the Big 12 was going to be the first, like no brainer? They were going to be the first ones to jump. Now they're hesitating. You talk about the Big 10 and the SEC are looking. Do you still feel like the Big 12 will ultimately be the first ones to jump, or are they just going to kind of hesitate and see what happens in the landscape of college football?
I think the Americans are going to be the first one to jump now, given this, because they've talked about private capital a bunch and how to bring it in. I think the Big 12 does do private capital. It's just going to be at a smaller scope than what Yormark wants. Like it's going to be a scope where member schools can feel like they've got some wiggle room to get out of the conference if they've got a Power 2 invite, guys. I think that's the truth of it. If the best case for the Big 12, though, is actually everyone saying we're all in and we're just going to do this thing for the long run, because you could really grow something special here. But there's just not that confidence level because of the financial disparity with the Power 2 and the Big 12 now, that schools just don't feel comfortable going all in. Yormark wants that. That's the best thing from a business standpoint, but you got to get your membership on board and sell them the vision. There needs to be more selling and selling and selling of the member schools, because I don't think they're fully there yet. But again, private capital does come into the Big 12. It's just going to be at a smaller scale scope and smaller financials than we thought.
Makes sense. Well, I want to thank you. You've opened my eyes to some of this, that's for sure. That's why I invited you on. I knew you would be one of the best people to come on and help me understand what in the world's going on there with the Big 12. But again, private capital across college sports, because as you mentioned, the Americans looking at it. We know what the Power 2's been looking at. And I've been pretty ignorant to it, so I feel a little less ignorant. Thank you so much for spending some time on the mountain.
For sure. It was a great conversation. Loved it, stuff. And I know it's not the most exciting conversation on the surface, but underneath it, there's a lot of realignment factors that are plates moving left and right that you have to kind of get down deeper to figure out. It's interesting stuff.
For sure. Hopefully our viewers enjoyed it. We again thank WildUte for joining us here on the Big Mountain. Steve, Any closing thoughts on that? Really good discussion.
Just a fantastic interview. I just want to thank the WildUte again. I mean, that was a great interview. Really getting the nuts and bolts of PE. Some things I didn't think of. I think of myself as a pretty educated college football fan, college sports fan. But there were some things I just didn't think of, and that was made apparent when he asked us a question, and we were both dumbfounded at one point. So great conversation. I will say, I did throw out a couple attempts to trip him up a little bit, and he had great answers. He's thought this through. You know me, I'm always the pessimist on stuff.
Sure.
We've covered the Pac, we covered the Florida State situation.
Right.
I still have concerns, and he brought up good ways to get around those concerns.
Right.
I still have concerns regarding public universities getting involved in this. And I kind of wonder, is that part of the deal with some of the university presidents? Does that just go into the calculus? Now, we have seen schools, I think Kentucky is trying to find a way around that by separating their athletic department. So there probably is ways around it. Maybe we're just not there yet. I still have those concerns. And again, we talked about the possibility of locking in public universities into a conference again.
Right. Yeah.
We're not talking about the state of Florida with their sovereign immunity laws, but this would just be another measure, another restriction, another agreement for public universities to enter into.
Yep.
And I have concerns regarding that. But I think he did alleviate some of my other concerns about PE, where you talked about, we think of PE as they're coming and they're buying a piece.
Yes.
He showed us an avenue that the Big 12 is looking at, where it's more of investing in new revenue streams,
right?
Which I think could be really interesting for conferences like the Big 12, maybe the American Conference or other programs. They're just trying to keep up with the biggest program. So great interview. He gave me a lot of things to think about. I still have some concerns though.
Sure. I anytime I hear private capital, again, that's just where I'm at. He did help me realize this hybrid model.
Yes.
I'm with you. More of a commission-based model is what I would call that. And I think that alleviates some of the public issue then too. Like you're not giving up your ownership rights there. You're giving up maybe some of the earned revenue, but you're not going to get that revenue without it anyway. So I think that maybe kills two birds, with one stone. The bird, whatever, red bird or whatever the heck it was called. Yeah. But I had to throw that pun in there. But yeah, so really, really interesting stuff there. And I still wonder, if conferences are going to go for this, because I was with you. You kind of hit it on the end there. I thought for sure the Big 12 was going to be doing something. Now I have a better understanding of that hybrid model. I'm actually really surprised they didn't, especially since they're the ones, as WildUte said, they have to find that new revenue to help close the gap with the Power 2. They need to be on kind of the forefront of that. And I think Yormark, before this pause, even came out and said, we're ready to we want to be at the forefront. We're ready to go. And then a few days later, I think it was, they're then on pause. And so, I hear what he's saying, and you mentioned Yormark's trying to do everything he can, pulling them along. Mm-hmm. Certainly looks like that. And they're just not ready to go. At least the majority of them aren't ready to go yet. So interesting dynamics there with the Big 12. So, hey, with that, we thank you guys for watching this episode. It was great to have WildUte on and talk some financial information, but absolutely talks about the big picture of college athletics and conference realignment. So, hey, we're going to do more of this stuff. We have a lot of interviews planned coming up here this week. We've got Ross Dellinger coming later in the week. That'll be a great interview as we talk CFP governance and anything else that we get into. So, hey, with that, make sure you give this one a like and subscribe. If you like our content, we'll see you next time on The Big Mountain.